On a storm-kissed evening in Oregon, a poor widow climbed into her attic, searching only for an old wedding dress to remember the husband she lost. But behind the dust and broken boxes, she uncovered something far stranger. An ancient camera, its leather worn, its reels of film whispering of forgotten years. She thought it was nothing more than junk, until shadows gathered outside her window, and a lonely German shepherd, scarred but loyal, appeared to guard her. What happened next would drag her from despair into a battle against thieves, a journey to the grand halls of New York, and a discovery worth millions. This is not just a tale of fortune. It is a story of loyalty, faith, and a second chance at light after years of darkness. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The small town of Willow Creek, tucked in the rugged folds of Oregon, was not kind in late October. The skies were heavy and leaden, a dull slate pressing down on the pine forests and the narrow streets. Rain had passed earlier in the day, leaving the roads slick and the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Wind pushed against the weather-beaten houses, rattling shutters and making the rusted gutters groan like tired old men. Willow Creek had always been a modest place, home to sawmill workers, shopkeepers, and retired veterans who had grown too tired to move elsewhere. But for those without steady income, autumn was the cruelest season, a reminder of heating bills soon to come and food stores that dwindled too quickly. In the center of this town, on Maple Street, stood a house that once had pride but now sagged under the weight of neglect. Its paint had peeled into strips, exposing the gray wood beneath, and the porch sagged slightly at the left corner as if bowing from exhaustion. Inside this house lived Eleanor Hart, a widow of 62 years. She was tall, though her frame had thinned with years of toil and grief. Her hair, once chestnut brown, had faded into strands of silver tied back in a simple bun. Her skin was pale, marked with lines etched by both laughter long ago and sorrow more recently. Her eyes were a watery blue, the kind that once sparkled when her husband was alive, but now dimmed by the shadow of bills stacked on the counter and nights spent staring at ceilings. Eleanor was not a woman of bitterness. Neighbors often described her as gentle, reserved, and polite. But she carried the unmistakable weight of poverty and loneliness, like a shawl she could never remove. Her husband, Richard Hart, had passed away 11 years earlier from a sudden stroke. Richard had been the kind of man who seemed carved from oak, broad-shouldered, with hands toughened by decades of carpentry. He had once been known in Willow Creek as the neighbor who fixed broken fences without asking for payment, and the man who told stories to children at the church picnic. Yet beneath his kindness was also a streak of silence. He was a keeper of memories, a man who collected things, who hated throwing away objects because he claimed that every item had a story. It was this habit that left their attic stuffed with boxes, relics of forgotten years. His absence had hollowed Eleanor's home, leaving her alone with leaking pipes, a roof in need of repair, and no steady income to soften the blows of life. On this cold October morning, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of bills. Electricity, gas, medical debts. The red ink of overdue notices screamed at her from every envelope. Her hands, thin and marked with veins, trembled as she shuffled through them. She had lived frugally since Richard's death, sewing her own clothes, cooking broth from bones, selling off small heirlooms piece by piece. Yet it was never enough. The pension had run out, odd cleaning jobs from neighbors paid too little, and now the threat of losing the house loomed over her like a hawk circling a field mouse. The house groaned around her, floorboards creaking with every gust of wind. The wallpaper, yellowed and curling at the corners, carried faint stains from decades past. She rose slowly, her joints stiff with age and labor, and moved from room to room. The living room still held the couch Richard had once fallen asleep on, with a newspaper across his chest. The hallway still smelled faintly of cedar from his jackets that hung untouched in the closet. Every corner carried his memory, and though it hurt, Eleanor clung to those echoes because without them, the silence would be unbearable. She paused at the stairwell leading to the attic. The hatch above had been closed for years, but this morning her eyes lingered on it. Dust rimmed the edges, and the pull string hung like a forgotten noose. She thought of Richard climbing up there in the past, descending later with boxes under his arm, his shirt streaked with dust, his expression unreadable. She had never asked what he was doing, too busy with the endless rhythm of daily life. And now she wished she had. Somewhere in that attic, hidden among old coats and newspapers, might be objects worth something, anything she could sell at the weekend market or a garage sale. Even a few dollars might pay for groceries, might buy another week of light before the power company cut her off. But as much as desperation pushed her toward the attic, her heart was pulled by something else entirely. Today marked 40 years since she had stood in a white gown before the altar with Richard. The church bells had rung bright that afternoon, echoing across Willow Creek, as a young Eleanor with flushed cheeks and eyes full of promise said her vows. She remembered his hand, strong and warm, holding hers as if nothing in the world could break them apart. 40 years. If he had lived, they might have celebrated with laughter, with their grown children returning home, with photographs added to albums. But now, on this anniversary, there was only silence. Eleanor whispered to herself, "I wonder if the dress is still there." Her voice cracked in the empty room, the words hanging like ghosts. The thought of finding her old wedding dress suddenly filled her with both dread and comfort. She had not seen it in decades. Perhaps it had yellowed, perhaps moths had claimed it. But to see it again, to touch it, might let her remember that girl she once was. And so she decided she would climb into the attic today. Not only to search for things to sell, but to find the dress that had once carried her into a new life. Gathering her strength, she fetched a wooden chair and dragged it beneath the hatch. Her knees ached as she climbed onto it, and her hands trembled as they reached for the string. She hesitated, whispering Richard's name under her breath, as if asking for permission. The house answered, only with the moan of wind against the window. Finally, she pulled. The hatch opened with a groan, and dust fell in a small cloud, making her cough. A wooden ladder creaked down slowly, hinges squealing like old bones. She stood at the bottom for a moment, staring into the black rectangle above. The smell of stale air drifted down, dry and thick with the scent of time. Somewhere in that darkness waited the remnants of a life she no longer fully understood, fragments Richard had guarded. Her heart thudded as she placed a foot on the first rung, then another, the wood rough beneath her palms. She climbed, step by step, until her head rose above the frame, and she entered the attic. The space was dim, the only light coming from a narrow window at the far end. Dust danced in the beam like restless spirits. Boxes towered in irregular stacks, their tape brittle and peeling. Old furniture slumped against the walls, chairs missing legs, a chest of drawers with one handle gone. Eleanor moved cautiously, her breath shallow, her eyes scanning the relics of the past. She knew somewhere here lay the dress, folded in silence. And she hoped, too, that perhaps she might uncover something else, something she could exchange for money, something that might keep her house and her dignity intact for a little longer. For now, she stood still, surrounded by the weight of years, and whispered to the shadows, "Richard, help me find it." And with that, Eleanor began her search through the gloom of the attic, unaware that this simple act of desperation would lead her to discoveries far beyond the wedding dress she longed to see again. The attic air was heavy, laced with the scent of dust and cedar, as Eleanor steadied herself among the stacks of boxes. The single narrow window admitted only a thin blade of light, enough to reveal swirls of dust dancing like tired phantoms. She moved slowly, her hands brushing the brittle cardboard of old cartons, her eyes searching for the garment bag that once held her wedding dress. After several minutes of shifting boxes and lifting old coats that smelled faintly of mothballs, she found it. The bag was yellowed with age, its zipper stiff, but she did not open it yet. She wanted to finish her search, to see what else the attic had concealed all these years. As she bent to place the garment bag aside, her gaze caught something unusual at the farthest corner of the attic, almost hidden beneath a collapsed stack of newspapers. A box made not of cardboard, but of solid wood. Its surface was darkened with time, the grain rich and worn, the edges reinforced with brass that had dulled to a greenish patina. It was not large, but it bore a certain weight of importance, as though it had been built to outlast all the flimsy things around it. Eleanor crouched, her knees protesting, and brushed away cobwebs. Her fingers traced the lid. It was smoother than she expected, as if someone had handled it often. She found a small latch, still intact, and after fumbling it yielded with a soft click. The lid lifted slowly, releasing a puff of stale air. Inside lay a nest of cloth wrapping, layered carefully, protecting what rested within. Eleanor's hands trembled as she peeled back the fabric. What emerged was a camera, unlike any she had seen before. Its body was compact and heavy, crafted from metal and wood, with a leather casing worn smooth by long handling. The lens, though clouded with dust, still gleamed faintly in the shaft of light. The design looked old-fashioned, stripped of the digital clutter she saw in modern devices her grandchildren once showed her. This was a tool from another age, built to endure, almost dignified in its simplicity. Alongside it were several small cylindrical canisters, film reels, their labels faded to near illegibility. She picked one up, holding it carefully between her fingers, and tilted it towards the window. Through the translucent strip, she could faintly see blurred shapes, shadows of figures, slivers of moments, but no detail clear enough to identify. Still, her breath caught in her throat. These were not blank rolls. These were memories, frozen decades ago. Eleanor sank onto an old trunk and studied the items in her lap. She remembered her husband Richard's secretive trips to the attic, how he would emerge with dust in his hair and a guarded look in his eyes. She had dismissed them then as the harmless quirks of a man who collected too much. Now she wondered, had he been hiding treasures of their life together? Was this camera one of his passions, something he had cherished privately, photographing the world with a craftsman's patience? She wished she could ask him. She wished she could hear his voice explaining how he came to own such a piece, why he had chosen to tuck it away rather than share it with her. Her fingers lingered on the reels. She thought of the possibility that they might contain images of their children when they were small, or of herself in younger days, smiling in gardens that had long since withered. The idea made her eyes sting. Yet she also knew she had no way to view them now. The house had no projector, no specialized lamp. To her they were fragments of ghosts sealed in strips of film. Still she pressed one to her chest. "I'll keep you," she murmured, speaking to the reels as though they were living things. "Whatever's on you, it's part of him, part of us." The camera, however, she regarded with different eyes. It was beautiful, but beauty did not feed hunger. She thought of the bills downstairs, the relentless march of due dates, the threats of disconnection. If the reels were sacred memories to guard, the camera could be a lifeline. Antique shops in town often bought old objects for a few dollars, sometimes more if the item was rare. Surely someone might want this, if not as a tool, then as a curiosity for a shelf. Even $20 or $30 would mean groceries for the week, or wood for the stove. She closed the wooden box, wrapping the camera gently again, though less carefully than her husband once had. She placed the reels aside, in a smaller cloth she kept for valuables, and tucked them into her cardigan pocket, as though to keep them close to her heart. Eleanor rose slowly, her body aching with the effort, and carried the wooden box down the ladder. The living room seemed different when she entered, as though the house itself recognized what she carried. She placed the box on the coffee table, the lid slightly ajar, the camera glinting faintly inside. She sat back on the worn sofa, staring at it, 1,000 thoughts colliding. She remembered Richard's laughter, the way he once posed with their children in the yard, pretending to take pictures with a toy camera they had bought at a fair. Could this have been the real tool he had dreamed of, the one he had guarded silently? She would never know for certain. As twilight crept over Willow Creek, the house grew colder. Eleanor lit a single lamp, its glow weak against the gathering dark. She looked at the reels once more, pulling one out of her pocket, and studied the faint silhouettes again. She could not tell if the blurred figure was Richard himself, or a child, or merely a stranger caught on film, but she held it as if it were holy. Then, with a deep breath, she returned it to her pocket. The box and camera, however, she left on the table, staring at them as though they might offer answers. Finally, she whispered aloud, "You will help me, won't you? Just enough." The words were half prayer, half plea, spoken to an inanimate object that might yet save her from ruin. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would carry it into town, to Trevor's shop or another dealer, and see what price it could fetch. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, the wind pressed against the windows, and the house shifted with old aches. She closed her eyes and pictured herself on her wedding day, Richard's hand in hers, the church bells ringing. 40 years. The dress still waited upstairs, but it was the camera and the reels that filled her thoughts now. One set she would keep for love, the other she would sell for survival. The choice had been made. The night settled heavily over Willow Creek, the kind of silence only small towns know, broken only by the sigh of wind against the shutters and the distant barking of a stray dog somewhere beyond Maple Street. Inside the Hart House, Eleanor sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the garment bag she had carried down from the attic earlier that afternoon. It lay folded neatly across the quilt, its zipper stiff with time, its fabric yellowed yet intact. For hours she had avoided it, telling herself she was too tired, too old, too sensible to indulge in old dresses when there were bills waiting on the counter. But the thought had gnawed at her steadily, whispering until she could not resist. Tonight, on what would have been their 40th wedding anniversary, she would see it again. Her hands shook as she tugged the zipper. The sound was sharp in the quiet room, a tearing through decades of dust. When the opening revealed white silk, her breath caught. She drew it out carefully, laying it across her lap. The fabric had yellowed, yes, but the lace still held its delicate patterns, and the tiny pearls sewn along the bodice glimmered faintly in the lamplight. It smelled faintly of cedar from years in storage, and beneath that of something older. Time itself. Eleanor rose slowly and slipped the dress over her shoulders. It no longer fit as snugly as it had when she was a young bride of 22, Her figure then fuller, her skin taut with youth, her hair long and chestnut brown. Now she was thin, her arms freckled with age, her silver hair pinned loosely at the back of her head. The sleeves draped differently. The waist hung loose. Yet as she looked into the mirror on the opposite wall, her reflection blurred. For a moment she could almost see the young woman she had been, smiling nervously, eyes wide with hope, clutching Richard's hand as the church bells rang. Her lips trembled into a whisper. "Richard." The sound cracked, lost in the quiet. She touched the mirror with her fingertips, tracing the outline of her own face as though searching for the girl she had once been. Her eyes filled with tears, spilling over as she stood there, draped in silk that had survived when so much else had not. On the dresser beside the mirror, the wooden box with the camera remained open. The object seemed to watch her, its lens like a single dark eye, unblinking. She moved toward it, the dress swishing faintly across the wooden floor. She lifted the camera with both hands, surprised again by its weight. The leather was cool beneath her fingers, worn but steady. She turned it over slowly, studying the dials she did not understand, the grooves etched by years of use. She remembered how Richard's hands had been thick and strong, yet precise in their work. Had he held it the same way, with reverence and care? Almost without thinking, she pressed her finger against the shutter button. The soft, mechanical click echoed in the stillness. It was such a small sound, but it struck her like thunder. The tears came freely then, running down her cheeks, dripping onto the dress. She covered her mouth with one hand, camera still clutched in the other, and let the sound of grief break free. Memories flooded her. Richard lifting her into his arms after the ceremony, their first small house with leaky pipes, the children's laughter in summer, his rough voice humming old songs when he thought no one was listening. Each memory struck her with a mixture of warmth and ache. The dress, the mirror, the camera, they all conspired to bring Richard back into the room, even if only in shadow. She sank into the chair by the window, the lamp casting her reflection onto the glass so that she seemed to float between the past and the present. Outside, the world remained indifferent. A gust of wind rattled the branches of the maple tree, scattering leaves across the yard. A train horn sounded faintly from miles away, its mournful note stretching across the night. Eleanor closed her eyes, clutching the camera tightly. "I miss you," she whispered. "I miss you every day." The words were a confession, a prayer, and a wound all at once. She sat there for a long while, letting the grief move through her. But even as sorrow overwhelmed her, the reality of her life pressed in again. The camera was beautiful, and perhaps meaningful, but it was also valuable in a different way. She thought of the empty pantry, the unpaid bills, the notices waiting on the counter. She thought of winter coming, the cold creeping into the bones of the house. She could not eat memories, nor warm herself with old photographs. Richard would not want her to starve clinging to relics. He had been practical in life, always reminding her that sentiment could not repair a leaking roof or put bread on the table. With trembling resolve, she set the camera back into the box. She folded the cloth over it once more, though not as meticulously as he once had. She would keep the film reels. They were pieces of him, slices of their life together. But the camera, she decided, would go. Tomorrow she would bring it into town, show it to one of the dealers, and ask for a fair price. Perhaps it would not fetch much, perhaps only a handful of bills, but even that would mean groceries, heat, the chance to stay in the house that still held Richard's laughter in its walls. She rose and hung the dress back on the hook of the closet door. It swayed gently, as though acknowledging her choice. She touched the fabric once more, then turned away, her face set in quiet determination. The house was still poor, her heart still heavy, but for the first time in weeks she felt she had a plan. When she finally lay down to sleep, the box with the camera rested on the nightstand beside her, its weight both a burden and a promise. The reels of film remained tucked in her cardigan pocket, close to her heart. As her eyes closed, she dreamed of Richard, standing at the end of a long aisle, waiting for her in the same suit he had worn 40 years ago. But when she reached him, he whispered only one thing. Keep moving forward. The morning air in Willow Creek was brittle, the kind that seemed to snap in the lungs when breathed too deeply. Frost had gathered across the grass, glinting pale beneath the weak sun. Eleanor wrapped her wool cardigan tightly around her shoulders as she stepped outside, the wooden box clutched carefully in her arms. She had not slept well. Images of Richard, the wedding dress, and the click of the camera had swirled through her dreams, leaving her with a heart that was both heavy and restless. Yet her decision was made. Today she would take the camera to Trevor's shop. Trevor Dalton was not a stranger. He was 35, the grandson of Eleanor's old neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, who had passed away 5 winters earlier. Eleanor had watched Trevor grow up as a lanky boy with too much curiosity and a mop of unruly dark hair. Now he was a man, stocky and broad-shouldered, his face framed by a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were a sharp hazel, always alert, betraying both warmth and a keen hunger for opportunity. After leaving college, Trevor had returned to Willow Creek and opened an antique shop in the old hardware building near Main Street. He had a reputation for honesty in small sales, but also a nose for rare finds. The bell above the shop door jingled as Eleanor entered. The air inside was warmer than the street, heavy with the scent of old wood polish and leather. Shelves stretched along the walls, crowded with brass candlesticks, porcelain figurines, and stacks of worn books. A gramophone rested on a corner table, its brass horn catching the morning light. Behind the counter stood Trevor, his sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms inked with faint scars, remnants of years working with wood and machinery. He looked up, his brow furrowing for a moment before recognition softened his features. "Mrs. Hart?" he greeted, his voice a blend of surprise and respect. "I wasn't expecting to see you out this early. What brings you by?" Eleanor shifted uneasily, tightening her grip on the box. I found something in the attic. I thought perhaps it might be worth a little. Enough to help." Her voice faltered. She placed the box on the counter. Trevor approached with curiosity. He lifted the lid gently, as though aware of its age. When the camera came into view, his entire posture stiffened. He reached out slowly, then stopped, his hands hovering just above it. Where did you get this?" His voice dropped, hushed. "It belonged to Richard," Eleanor replied softly. "I only found it last night. I thought it might fetch a few dollars." Trevor swallowed hard, then carefully lifted the camera. He turned it in his hands, his expression caught between awe and disbelief. "This isn't just any camera," he murmured. "This looks like a Leica prototype. My God!" His hazel eyes darted toward Eleanor, searching her face. "You said Richard kept this? All these years?" She nodded slowly, unsure why his reaction carried so much weight. To her, it was just a machine. Beautiful, yes, but still a tool of the past. Trevor set it down carefully and straightened. "Mrs. Hart, I don't want to alarm you, but if this is what I think it could be extraordinary. I need to call someone, an expert." Eleanor blinked. An expert? For an old camera? Trevor gave a small, nervous laugh. Not just an old camera. If I'm right, this could be one of the rarest cameras in the world. Before she could protest, he moved to the back room and dialed a number on his phone. Eleanor stood near the counter, her fingers twisting the edge of her cardigan, her heart thudding with unease. The shelves around her seemed suddenly closer, the eyes of porcelain dolls staring down as though privy to secrets she could not fathom. Within an hour, a man arrived, a specialist from Portland named Harold Whitmore. He was in his late 50s, tall and gaunt, with thinning gray hair combed back and glasses perched precariously on a sharp nose. His suit was tailored but worn, the cuffs frayed, suggesting a man more consumed by his passion for history than by wealth. His voice was clipped, precise, carrying the cadence of a professor. Trevor ushered him in eagerly. "Harold, thank you for coming so quickly. You need to see this." Harold approached the counter, his eyes narrowing as Trevor uncovered the camera. For a long moment he said nothing, only leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, studying every curve and seam. Then, almost reverently, he reached out and touched the body. His fingers traced the engravings, the lens, the winding mechanism. His lips moved silently, as though reciting a prayer. Finally he spoke. This is not merely a Leica. This is the Leica 0 Series number 05. His voice quivered with restrained excitement. "Do you understand what you have here?" Eleanor's brow furrowed. "No, I don't understand any of this. It was Richard's. He never spoke of it." Harold turned to her, his expression solemn. "Mrs. Hart, only a handful of these were ever produced in 1923. Fewer than a dozen are known to survive. The last one that appeared at auction sold for $13 million. He paused, letting the number settle in the air. "This is not just a camera. This is a piece of history, a relic that collectors across the world would fight to own." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Her knees weakened, and she gripped the counter for balance. $13 million? She could barely imagine 1,000, let alone millions. The weight of it pressed down on her, colliding with years of poverty, with nights spent shivering under thin blankets, with the steady terror of unpaid bills. Trevor placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's real, Mrs. Hart. I promise you. You've been holding something priceless all these years without knowing it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt dizzy, the shop spinning around. Her, the shelves and trinkets blurring into shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest, torn between disbelief and the wild spark of hope that flared against the darkness of her life. She sank into a chair Trevor quickly pulled out for her. Harold continued, his voice softer now. "We'll need to authenticate it formally, of course, but I have no doubt. The serial number, the details, they match perfectly. Mrs. Hart, this camera could change everything for you." Eleanor pressed a trembling hand against her face. She thought of Richard again, his secretive trips to the attic, the way he had carried boxes with quiet reverence. Had he known? Had he understood the worth of what he was hiding? Or had he simply cherished it as a passion, unaware of its immense value? Tears welled in her eyes. For years she had lived in shadows, surrounded by loss, drowning in debts. And now, in a small antique shop in Willow Creek, a miracle had stepped out of the dust. She whispered, barely audible, 13 million. As if saying the number aloud might shatter it into a dream. Trevor crouched beside her, his hazel eyes steady. "It's real, Mrs. Hart. And it's yours." Eleanor sat in silence, clutching her cardigan around her, her heart a storm of grief, awe, and fragile hope. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of light breaking through the gloom. The news had traveled faster than Eleanor imagined. In a small town like Willow Creek, secrets were fragile things, easily broken by whispers that slipped from one porch to another. Though Trevor and Harold had promised discretion, the mere sight of strangers from Portland driving into town had drawn attention. By the end of the week, the story of an extraordinary discovery in the possession of an old widow had leaked into conversations at the diner, the post office, and the church steps. Eleanor could feel it each time she walked down the street, eyes lingering on her longer than usual, voices dropping suddenly to a hush when she passed, neighbors offering too bright smiles tinged with curiosity. It was not long before unease took root. At night, she thought she saw figures moving at the edge of her yard, shadows that vanished when she stepped to the window. Footsteps crunched on gravel long after curfew, then fell silent when the porch light flicked on. The old boards of her house groaned more loudly than ever, and though she told herself it was only the wind, her heart thudded in her chest with dread. The Leica was no longer just an object. It had become a beacon, calling to greed in hearts she did not know. Fearing for her safety, Eleanor made a decision. One Sunday afternoon, after service, she approached Father Thomas, the priest at St. Mary's Church. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes hidden behind thick spectacles, a round face lined with wrinkles from both laughter and sorrow. His hair was white, thinning at the crown, and his voice carried the calm assurance of someone who had guided generations through hardship. Eleanor explained in trembling words that she could no longer keep the camera in her home. Father Thomas listened patiently, folding his hands together. "My child," he said softly, "this is not just about money. This is about temptation. Evil is quick to circle when it smells weakness. Leave it with me. The church has a safe, stronger than any lock in town. It will rest there until the auction." Relief washed over Eleanor. That afternoon, she carried the wooden box into the cool, stone-walled vestry of the church. Father Thomas led her to a heavy iron safe in his office, hidden behind a curtain. Together they placed the camera inside, and the door clanged shut with finality. Eleanor felt as though a weight had lifted from her shoulders, though she knew the shadows would not give up so easily. It was then she noticed him, the dog. He lingered near the side of the churchyard, lying on the grass beneath the maple trees. A German shepherd, large and powerful, with a coat of mixed tan and black. His fur was ragged in places, his ribs faintly visible beneath, and one ear bore a jagged scar as though torn in some long-ago fight. Yet his amber eyes were steady, intelligent, and startlingly gentle when they turned toward her. Father Thomas smiled faintly when he saw Eleanor's gaze. "Ah, that one. He's been here for years. Belongs to no one, yet belongs to us all. The children call him Sentinel. He guards this place, though no one asked him to." The dog rose slowly, padding toward Eleanor with a cautious dignity. His steps were firm despite his lean frame, and when he reached her he sat and looked up, his head tilted slightly. Eleanor extended a hand. He sniffed her fingers, then pressed his nose softly against her palm, as though sealing an unspoken pact. From that day forward, Sentinel became part of Eleanor's visits to the church. Each morning she brought scraps of bread or a bit of meat saved from her table. Each evening she would find him still there, pacing the grounds, his ears pricked at every sound. Children climbed onto his back as though he were a horse, and parishioners scratched his head as they left evening prayers. He never barked without reason, never snapped, never strayed far from the churchyard. To Eleanor, it felt as though Richard himself had sent her this guardian, a living shadow to watch over the treasure and, perhaps, over her. But greed has patience, and darkness waits for weakness. It was nearly midnight on a cold Thursday when the attempt came. Eleanor had been restless, sleep eluding her as the wind rattled loose shingles on her roof. Across town, St. Mary's lay silent, its stained glass windows black against the night. Sentinel dozed near the front steps, his body curled into the shape of the stone lions carved long ago into the railing. His ears twitched at the faint crunch of gravel. 3 men emerged from the shadows. They were strangers, their faces half hidden by scarves and the brims of caps pulled low. The tallest of them moved with a swagger, his jacket bulky, his hands gloved. Another was wiry, thin as a rail, his movements jerky with nervous energy. The third had a heavy jaw covered in stubble, his eyes darting like a predator testing the wind. They carried a crowbar, a canvas sack, and the arrogance of men who thought they would not be caught. The tall one whispered, "Quick, in and out. Old priest won't know till morning." But Sentinel knew. His head lifted, ears stiff. A growl rumbled in his chest, low and steady. The men froze, eyes darting towards the shape in the dark. The wiry one hissed, "It's just a stray dog. Scare him off." The tall one stepped forward, swinging the crowbar threateningly. Sentinel rose, his hackles bristling, teeth bared. He barked once, sharp and commanding, the sound splitting the night like a warning bell. The thieves flinched. Then the dog lunged. The fight was sudden, brutal. Sentinel sank his teeth into the arm of the tall man, forcing him to drop the crowbar with a clang. The wiry thief kicked, his boot catching Sentinel's side, but the dog twisted, snapping at his leg until fabric tore. The heavy-jawed man swung the canvas sack like a club, striking Sentinel across the ribs. The dog yelped in pain but did not retreat. His barks rang out, echoing, against the stone walls, filling the night with alarm. Inside the rectory, Father Thomas awoke. He grabbed a lantern and rushed to the door. Across the street, neighbors stirred, windows lighting as shouts rose. The thieves realized too late the price of their greed. With Sentinel's jaws snapping and his growls unrelenting, they turned and fled into the dark, leaving the crowbar abandoned and the sack empty. When Eleanor arrived minutes later, breathless from running, she found the scene bathed in lantern glow. Father Thomas stood in the doorway, his robe flapping in the wind, while neighbors clustered with anxious faces. At the center of it all lay Sentinel, his side matted with blood where the sack had struck, his breaths ragged but his eyes still fierce. Eleanor fell to her knees beside him, her hands, trembling, pressed against his fur, feeling the warmth of his life still there. Tears blurred her vision. "Oh, you brave soul," she whispered. She stroked his scarred ear, her voice breaking. "Richard, you've sent me a protector." Sentinel lifted his head weakly and licked her hand once, before resting it back on the ground. His eyes closed, but his chest still rose and fell with steady breath. Eleanor gathered him into her arms, cradling the bloodied dog as though he were a child. Around them, the church bells began to toll, rung by Father Thomas to summon the town. The sound spread through Willow Creek, a cry of warning, a call of triumph. The thieves had been driven away, and in their place remained something stronger than fear: loyalty, sacrifice, and a guardian no one had claimed yet everyone would now honor. The journey to New York felt like stepping into another world. Eleanor had not left Willow Creek in years. Her life had been bound to the cracked sidewalks, faded porches, and dusty church pews of her small town. Now, sitting in the back seat of a black sedan provided by the auction house, she watched the towering skyline rise in the distance, glittering with glass and steel. The sight overwhelmed her. So much movement, so much noise, a city that never seemed to pause for breath. At her side, Sentinel sat upright, his head high, eyes alert, his thick tan and black coat brushed clean by Father Thomas that very morning. Though thin from years on the street, the dog carried himself with the quiet dignity of a soldier. He leaned once against Eleanor's arm, a silent reassurance. When they arrived at the grand marble steps of Harrington and Coverdor auctioneers, Eleanor felt her heart pound. The building loomed like a palace, its wide columns gleaming in the noon sun. Men in sharp suits and women in gowns swept past her, their shoes clicking on polished stone. She hesitated, clutching her worn handbag, her simple blue dress marking her as out of place in this sea of wealth. But Sentinel stepped forward first, his paws steady, his amber eyes catching the light. It was as if he were telling her, "You belong here too." Inside, the auction hall gleamed with chandeliers that spilled light across velvet chairs and long mahogany tables. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of sparkling champagne. Eleanor sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Father Thomas had joined her for support, his white hair glowing under the golden lights, his calm presence soothing. Sentinel lay at her feet, though his ears twitched at every sound, his body tense, ready. Around them sat collectors from around the world, sharp-faced men with cold eyes, elegant women draped in jewels, and younger investors scribbling figures on notepads. Eleanor felt their glances dart toward her, whispers rippling about the widow from nowhere who carried fortune in her hands. At last, the moment came. A tall man strode to the podium, his black tuxedo crisp, his salt and pepper hair combed back immaculately. This was Charles Whitmore, the auctioneer, renowned in New York for his commanding presence. His voice rang out clear, warm but sharp-edged, like steel polished to brilliance. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering for this historic occasion. Tonight we present an item that has already stirred great anticipation, the Leica Zero Series No. 105, one of only a handful ever crafted in 1923, a true relic of photographic history. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. A pair of attendants wheeled in a glass display case. Inside, resting on red velvet, sat the Leica. Polished and gleaming beneath the lights, it looked almost alive, its lens catching the glow like a watchful eye. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She could almost see Richard's hands holding it, his quiet smile. She reached down and stroked Sentinel's head. The dog pressed closer against her leg. Charles raised his gavel. "We will begin bidding at $1 million. The room came alive. A man in the second row lifted his paddle instantly. $1 million, Charles confirmed, his voice rolling like thunder. Do I hear 2? Another hand shot up. 2 million. 3 million. The numbers rose with astonishing speed. Eleanor sat frozen, her lips parted, her chest tight. She had never seen such sums written anywhere but in newspapers, never imagined they could be spoken so casually. The collectors leaned forward, eyes sharp, their hunger palpable. 5 million. The words rang out from a woman draped in emerald silk, her hair a cascade of silver curls, her gaze fixed on the Leica like a hawk. 6 million, countered a young man in rimless glasses, his pen tapping nervously on his knee. 8 million, came from a deep-voiced man with a heavy jaw, his tailored suit straining at the shoulders. His expression was grim, as though he were claiming not just an object but a prize to crush all rivals. The tension built, each number climbing higher, the air crackling. Eleanor could not move, could hardly breathe. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Sentinel, sensing her distress, lifted his head, his eyes steady on her face, grounding her. 10 million, Charles announced, his voice steady but tinged with awe. The room gasped collectively. Some bidders lowered their paddles, shaking their heads, defeated. Only 2 remained, the woman in emerald silk and the heavy-jawed man. 11 million, she declared, her voice cool. 12, he countered, his jaw clenching. Silence fell. All eyes darted between the two, the air thick with anticipation. Then, slowly, the woman raised her paddle once more. 13 million. The gavel hovered in Charles's hand. $13 million. Going once, going twice. A pause, a breathless hush that seemed to suspend time. No other paddle lifted. And sold. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Applause erupted, a thunderous wave rolling through the hall. Cameras flashed, voices rose, and collectors murmured their admiration. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The world blurred as she pressed her hands to her face. For years she had lived in shadows, her nights filled with fear and grief. Now, here, in this grand hall, she felt as though Richard himself stood beside her, smiling with quiet pride. Through the applause, she heard his voice in memory. Keep moving forward. Sentinel lifted his head, his amber eyes shining in the light. He did not bark, did not stir, only sat as silent witness. In that moment, he seemed more than a dog. He was a guardian, a companion, a fragment of faith made flesh. Eleanor placed her hand on his back, her tears falling freely. We did it, she whispered. We're safe now. He's smiling at us. I know it. The applause swelled again, and in the midst of fortune, marble, and glittering chandeliers, a widow and her stray dog sat together, bound not by wealth, but by love and the miracle of survival. The train pulled into Willow Creek just as the sun was setting, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. Eleanor stepped down slowly, the weight of her years mingled with the lightness in her heart. Beside her padded sentinel, head high, his gait steady though the scar on his side still showed faintly through his thick fur. Townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the rumors that had swept across the valley like wildfire. They saw her not as the poor widow they had whispered about weeks ago, but as a woman transformed, her back straighter, her eyes alight with purpose. Children pointed toward the great dog, whispering excitedly, and Sentinel, unbothered, allowed them to stroke his head as Eleanor smiled gently. The days that followed were filled with decisions Eleanor could not have imagined in her wildest dreams. The funds from the auction were transferred under careful guidance from Trevor and Father Thomas. She insisted the first portion go directly to the church, and specifically toward a dream Richard had once spoken of but never achieved. A school for the children of Willow Creek. It began as a simple idea, but soon architects were summoned. Among them, Margaret Lee, a short, energetic woman in her 40s with sharp black hair cut neatly at the jawline, glasses perched on her nose, and a quickness in her speech that revealed both intelligence and determination. She had grown up in a mining family nearby, always believing that education was the only ladder out of poverty. When Eleanor shared her vision, Margaret clasped her hands and promised, "We'll build it strong, something that will last generations." The groundbreaking of the school became an event in itself. Neighbors gathered, watching as earth was turned on a plot of land once barren. Eleanor, standing modestly in her plain cardigan, felt tears slide down her cheeks as she imagined children laughing there one day. Sentinel sat beside her, tail swishing slowly, his amber eyes surveying the crowd like a sentinel indeed. But Eleanor's generosity did not stop there. She met with Father Thomas in the rectory, the old priest listening carefully as she outlined another idea. Richard loved photography, she said, her fingers curled around a teacup. He never had the chance to study it properly. I want other young people with that same fire to have a chance. A scholarship, Father. His name on it, so it won't be forgotten. Father Thomas's eyes grew moist behind his spectacles. You are giving him immortality, he whispered. Thus was born the Richard Hart Memorial Scholarship for Aspiring Photographers, Notices were placed in local newspapers and even national journals, and applications soon began to pour in from students with cameras slung over their shoulders and dreams in their eyes. Eleanor read their words carefully, tears often smudging the ink, as she saw fragments of her husband's spirit reflected in each. The people of Willow Creek began calling her the woman who brought back the light. It was not merely because of her wealth, but because she chose to share it. Once they had pitied her. Now they admired her. Yet Eleanor herself felt humbled rather than exalted. Each morning she still brewed her modest pot of tea, still swept her porch, still paused to lay her hand on the scarred head of Sentinel, who now lived permanently at her side. Sentinel had claimed her home as his own. He slept near the hearth in the evenings, his steady breathing a comfort against the silence. By day he followed her faithfully, whether she was walking to the market, tending the small garden behind her house, or sitting on the porch with a book. When children ran to greet him, he stood patiently, allowing their laughter to spill over him like sunlight. To Eleanor he was not simply a dog, he was family, confidant, guardian, and, in some unspoken way, a gift sent by Richard himself. Weeks turned into months, and the chill of autumn returned once more. On the evening of what would have been her 40th wedding anniversary, Eleanor prepared quietly. She retrieved the old garment bag once more, lifting the wedding dress that had survived decades of dust and grief. She slipped it over her shoulders, its fabric now looser, its lace fragile but still intact. In the mirror, she saw both the girl she had been and the woman she had become. In the living room, she lit 2 candles on the mantelpiece. The flames flickered, casting warm light across the worn furniture and the photographs that lined the shelves. She stood between them, her hands clasped, and whispered, "You didn't just leave me memories, Richard. You left me a companion, a protector. You made sure I would not walk alone." Sentinel rose from his spot by the hearth and padded over. He sat beside her, looking up with eyes that seemed to hold all the patience of the world. Eleanor laughed softly through her tears. "Shall we dance, old friend?" She turned to the center of the room, lifting her arms as though she were once again a bride on a polished church floor. Slowly, she swayed, the hem of her dress brushing the wooden planks. Her steps were clumsy, her body aged, but her spirit soared. Sentinel did not move, only watched with unwavering devotion, his tail sweeping gently against the floor in rhythm, his amber gaze glowing in the candlelight. Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining Richard's hand guiding her, the music of long-ago bells filling her ears. Around her, the house glowed brighter than it ever had, no longer a tomb of sorrow, but a sanctuary of love renewed. She whispered, breathless, "This is our dance, all 3 of us." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of children's laughter from the nearby schoolyard construction. Inside, in that little living room, a widow and her faithful dog celebrated not only a marriage remembered, but a future reclaimed. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, a poor widow found not just a camera worth millions, but a reminder that God's miracles often come hidden in the dust of our ordinary lives. Through grief, loneliness, and fear, Eleanor discovered light again, not through riches alone, but through love, faith, and the loyal heart of a dog who stood by her side. Sometimes the Lord answers not with thunder, but with small mercies, a forgotten memory, a faithful guardian, a chance to give back. And so, dear friends, may we each remember that no matter how heavy the shadows, God's light can always break through. He sends us companions, miracles, and second chances when we least expect them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another tale of faith, loyalty, and hope. May God bless you and your family, and may His light guide your days just as it guided Eleanor's.